Behind me is a portion of the cyclorama at Gettysburg National Military Park in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the scene of the largest battle of the American Civil War. It covered 3 days, July 1st through 3rd, 1863, and became the, um, uh, the scene a few months later of Abraham Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. This painting, if you went to the military park today and went to the visitor center, you would find that this painting goes 360 degrees. You would go in effect, to the center of this canvas, and you would be able to see entirely around you. The painting, in effect, places you at the center of the action at the height of Pickett's charge, the last Confederate attack on the third day of the battle. It was done in the 1880s by a French painter who actually did several of these. These were sort of the 19th century equivalent of a movie in terms of the the way in which it could place people, the scene of some kind of important event. So they were rather like that and very popular. The canvases would be rolled up and taken from one place to another to different cities, and people would pay money to come in and look at them. The Gettysburg Cyclorama is the most famous of these. Well, I've chosen this as the background for this introduction to this week's module, um, by way of saying that this was the United States' first experience with modern war that we've been looking at uh, in previous modules. And it ended, of course, with a decisive Union victory and the destruction of the Confederacy. And for many Americans, including veterans of the conflict, this outcome was entirely satisfactory from the point of view of the effectiveness of the U.S. Army, commonly called the Union Army during the Civil War. But there were reformers in the regular army, most notably an officer named Emory Upton, whom you're going to see, who noticed mostly the shortcomings of the Union military effort. Um, and in the post-Civil War period, proposed important military reforms to the Army. Now, this was countervailed by a volunteer oriented tradition that remains strong in American life. Historically, the United States had what's called a dual manpower tradition, consisting of actually a minority of regular Army forces and then a majority of volunteer forces. And this had been the structure that had been in place since the Revolutionary War. And there were champions of this volunteer tradition, like a congressman named John A. Logan, whom you're going to encounter. But the period between 1865 and 1898 found the United States in the same position as other powers throughout the world of having to modernize their forces in light of societies that were becoming urbanized, industrialized, based upon manufacturing, larger populations, and then a much greater ability to put armies in the field, massive firepower, and so forth. The United States found itself dealing with this challenge as much as any other major country in the world. So part of what I would like for you to be looking at this week in this week's presentation is the American effort to modernize in the post-Civil War period in terms of its army, but perhaps even more importantly, the United States modernized in terms of its Navy. The basic strategy of the U.S. Navy before the Civil War had been that of commerce raiding. In other words, it didn't create a Navy large enough to challenge any major European navy, certainly not the major potential adversary, the British Royal Navy. Instead, the American Navy was based upon putting to sea in terms of like one ship, maybe a couple of ships moving out at sea and attacking enemy merchant vessels. This is what's called commerce raiding. And the American Civil War marked a departure from commerce raiding because the Union Army, the Union Navy, was tasked with the responsibility for blockading the entire Confederate coast and with capturing all Confederate ports, which required an entirely different orientation for the Navy, both in terms of the ability to blockade a very extensive Confederate coast, and in terms of the ability to create kind of a battle-oriented fleet whose enemy was not a Confederate Navy, which was actually still oriented toward commerce raiding. It was all the Confederates could do, but rather of battering their way into Confederate harbors. So, but after the war, the U.S. Navy contracted from having over 500 naval vessels to having much fewer than that, and then there was a period of time in which there were some naval thinkers who proposed to move back to a commerce raiding strategy when looking toward the future, but there were also proponents of the creation of a U.S. Navy capable of fighting against a major European navy in this case. So we're talking about a battleship-oriented navy, and so that's the second part of the presentation you'll be watching this week. Now, this presentation was created for another course that I teach on American military history from colonial times, which basically be the early 1600s, down to the early part of the 20th century, specifically until about 1903, 1910, and thereabouts. So as you watch this presentation, you're going to undoubtedly notice moments in it that indicate that this is a course that was originally for an American military history course. There'll be some references that you won't be familiar with initially, and so on. Don't let that throw you. You should be able to figure out most of what's going on, partly from this orientation that I'm giving you, but primarily from the presentation itself, which I think supplies sufficient context so that you can understand what's going on. The terms and learning objectives are also oriented specifically for this American military history course, but nearly all of them are developed adequately or sort of defined adequately in the course of this presentation. So I don't think you don't need any background in American military history per se to understand what's going on. It's almost a 50-minute presentation, but you should have plenty of time to watch it, because the readings for this week are the same readings as for the previous modules on the emergence of modern war. So there's no new reading for this course. Okay, I hope with this brief orientation, you'll be well positioned to watch this week's presentation and to profit from it.